Debates are raging everywhere about what's right and wrong with public education in the United States, and we hear conflicting paradigms about the purposes of education and competing agendas for how to reform or transform it. On the one end of the spectrum, we hear a dominant narrative, a corporate education agenda that's backed by government policies and wealthy funders, and that basically promotes standardized testing and curriculum, school privatization, union busting, attacks on ethnic studies, and a lot more that we are talking about through this Flashpoints education series. And on the other end of the spectrum is a growing resistance and blossoming movements for anti-oppressive, culturally relevant, and socially just education. These debates haven't actually just begun with George Bush or No Child Left Behind, but they have, in fact, been raging since the colonizers, the slave traders, and the settlers invaded the indigenous peoples of the continent and set up shop on the land we're now calling the United States. So some people say the educational system is broken and failing, and other people say that the educational system is actually operating perfectly, that schools are accomplishing exactly what they were originally designed for, to sort people into winners and losers, to track, to control, and ultimately to reproduce social, cultural, and economic power relationships. And today we want to look at these competing narratives and paradigms around education in both their historical and their current context. And so to help us do that, we are very excited and honored to be joined in studio by Dr. Joel Westheimer. He's a professor of education and democracy at the University of Ottawa in Canada, and he is also an education columnist for CBC, Canadian Public Radio. So Dr. Joel Westheimer, welcome to Flashpoints, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Ken. It's a pleasure to be here.
Cool. So let me ask you to say a little bit more about what's important to know about you and the work that you've been doing in education.
That's a great question, a great place to begin. I grew up in a youth organization that had a summer camp, and I was never interested in education as a career. When I was younger, I had interest in music and in computer science and in all kinds of things. But I always had this experience of a lot of time I spent in this youth organization, and the summer camp was an educational environment. It was kind of a lefty progressive summer camp, and it was an educational environment that gave me a sense of a kind of education that could be, but was not, in either the public or the private education system. And that education was something like this. We had a lot of young adults and youth and young adults getting together to plan educational activities and fun activities. It ran the gamut. But coming together and doing it in a way that took ideas seriously, right? That took ideology seriously, and it had a kind of it was a socialist summer camp, and what I loved about it is that I was growing up with my friends, and we were planning these educational activities together, and we were doing it for kids around real ideas and real things and taking those kids' ideas seriously. And so first of all, it was 24-hour time together, right? And there have been educational experiments along those lines for sure. But second of all, it was taking the idea that kids have authentic experiences and ways of looking at the world that are valuable, and that we can use to pivot into learning and exposure to all kinds of ideas. And that always remained with me as this kind of alternative educational ideal. And when I eventually did go into teaching, I took from those experiences the idea that something else was possible for public education in the United States. And that something else, or many something else's, has really become the foundation of what I've done in education since.
Wow. That's very cool. So can you take us on a little bit of a historical journey or background into the public education system? How did public education come about, and what do you think its purposes were historically?
Well, I think I'm not an educational historian, but I'm going to give you my interpretation of kind of two stories that are simultaneously true, right? On the one hand, we have this ideal of public education in the United States, and it went something like this. In a democratic nation, we need people who are properly educated to govern their own affairs. It's what democracy requires. So the famous Thomas Jefferson quote that I'm about to, destroy, but I'll paraphrase it as best I can, but that if an education is not well educated enough to take part in governing their own affairs, the solution is not to take that power of control away from them, but rather to educate them. And so right there we had these seeds of the idea that the purpose of public education was to further a democratic society, that in democratic societies we need people who know how to participate, who are predisposed to participate in helping to govern their affairs, who want to participate, and who have the knowledge and skills and abilities to participate. Now that's the ideal, and it's an ideal narrative, and of course it's never been fully true, and certainly at the beginning it wasn't true. Public education was mostly for religious education initially. When the idea of public education took hold and spread, it was of course just for whites. It was initially for wealthy. Went to the degree that it then was extended to poor children. It was to civilize them, and then across the board, it was much as we have some similar strands of this today. It was to prepare kids for the workforce, to get them ready for an economy. It was what the business economy wanted. Now we have that more today than ever in the history, but. And so both those things were true, right? We have that ideal that we still come back to, and we have the reality of what public education was. But I think that ideal nourishes us in a lot of what we do in schools today, because the fact is, I often do this thought experiment when I talk with people or talk to my students, and I say, imagine you were blindfolded and whisked up into space, and you were spun around, 100 times, and the Earth is moving below you, and then at some point you were dropped back down into some classroom somewhere on the planet. Right? Someone takes the blindfold off, and since it's a thought experiment, we can pretend that you don't know where you are based on what language is being spoken or the way people are dressed and so forth. But I ask people this: would you be able to tell whether you had landed in a school in a democratic nation or in a totalitarian or an authoritarian nation? And I get people to think about that, because at first it seems like a facetious question, like, well, we hope we'd be able to tell, of course, like schools here are nothing like the way they would be in China or Indonesia. But when you think about it, of course, a lot of the lessons would be very much the same, a lesson in math and chemistry and a foreign language. So I ask people, and I ask myself, then what is or should be different about schools in a democratic society? And that's where I go back to this historic ideal of what the purpose of public education was and is in the United States. And that is to nourish democratic participation and to ensure that we have a population that's able to participate in governing their own affairs and in democratic life. Now, we haven't always reached that ideal, and it's certainly historically there are many failings along the way. But it's something that we can strive for, and it's something that shapes the ultimate goals of public education in this country.
Thank you for that. So let's connect the dots between some of that earlier educational history and those two different types of narratives historically, and look at what's actually battling out today about the future of education in the United States. What is the paradigm about the purposes of education and the hidden curriculum that sits underneath the corporate-driven education agenda?
Yeah, unfortunately, we're living through an unprecedented time right now where what used to be the broad purposes of education have been narrowed to a myopic focus on so-called standards and accountability in only two subject areas, math and literacy. And then even within those two subject areas, only the most narrow and emaciated conception of what those areas have to offer. And so it's as if we've taken the entire realm of educational practice and put it, narrowed it into this teensy little place where there's no elbow room for teachers to maneuver. Now, there are many theories of how that came to pass, and one of them, as you're mentioning, is certainly that there is this underlying corporate agenda that has a long-standing history to prepare students for the workforce. And it doesn't mean we need a cabal of cigar-smoking tobacco executives in a room kind of having a conspiracy theory about how we're going to make sure that kids don't think or operate factory machinery without asking questions. I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I don't think that's the case. But I do think that we have a cultural zeitgeist right now where and a lot of money involved and a lot of money to be made off the public education system, where we have a conspiring set of forces, if not a conspiracy itself, that are taking public education down a road that is unfortunate, especially given its history and the furthering of democratic goals. And that is to simply prepare children for a workforce, to reduce critical thinking rather than expanding it, and to reduce teachers to technocrats who are there to facilitate learning based on some kind of scripted curriculum that takes kids through preordained lessons and with preordained destinations. And education has never really worked that way, and of course it's not always working that way today as well, but we have a trend, a direction where it's being pushed that is pushing out other educational goals that I think are critically important.
You said there's a lot of money to be made from that. I'm wondering, what is driving it? Is it driven by money? Is it driven by ideology? What's behind those people who are pushing that particular narrative?
I think it's all of the above, because there are definitely people out there seeing this as an opportunity to demean public education to the point where the only thing that makes sense in the public's eyes is to privatize everything. And this isn't limited to education. We're seeing this in every sector of society. And of course, what's at stake there is for-profit schools where businessmen know that this is a multi-billion-dollar potential industry with public taxpayer funds being siphoned off to pay for privatized institutions, and so you're going to get a lot of push in that. Now, I think that's true for some people, and I think it's blatant and transparent for some of those. I also think that there's a fair number of well-meaning people who see an inescapable logic of the idea that, of course, we need standards, right? Why wouldn't we have teachers being accountable? How can you run any institution without anyone being accountable? And we can all understand that line of thinking, right? I mean, how do teachers know what to teach if we're not setting some particular specific educational goals, right? The problem is that most educators know that real teaching and learning doesn't happen that way, that teaching and learning is about relationship. It's about the relationship between the teacher and the students, between and among the students themselves, and that schooling is not a technocratic enterprise as much as a human enterprise. And humans are complex and messy and about social relationships. So while there, of course, on the one hand, there's kind of a straw man argument, this standards. Like, I've never met a teacher who doesn't have standards. Everyone has standards, right? And everyone feels accountable to other people. Teachers are accountable to the parents, to principals, to their students, and so on. What we're talking about here, though, is a mechanized idea of standards and accountability that gives no room for local context and no room for individual creativity, initiative, and relationship. And that's unfortunately what's happening in our classrooms across the country, at the same time, of course, that prescriptions of ADHD medications and stronger psychotropic medications and antidepressants is skyrocketing because we're creating institutions where children can't function as children, that are not designed for them but are designed for some kind of mechanistic ideal of what education could be and or should be. as you mentioned, there's a lot of pushback to this as well, and I'm hoping it's going to be swinging in the other direction.
Mm-hmm. Let's actually go there. What would the other direction look like? What is a social justice perspective on the purposes and paradigms that should be guiding education?
Yeah, I mean, since the series is talking about social justice education broadly, and of course a lot of people use those terms to mean a lot of different things. On the one hand, social justice in one form, one way of looking at it in particular historically was about access to education, right? And in that sense, public education in the United States is one of the most successful social policy experiments in the history of the world. I mean, fewer than 50% of children went to public school between the ages of 5 and 19 at the turn of the century, and we're now in the mid-90s in that regard over just a few decades really, and so it's a remarkably successful experiment in that sense. Once you raise the bar to not just to, access to education, but equal access to education, of course it gets much more complicated. And at the beginning, certainly it was only whites who went to school. It was only men. That's been an ever-expanding pie, but as we know from works like Jonathan Kozol's Savage Inequalities and all the research that's followed as well, there's radically unequal access to education, and in fact today's schools are just as, if not more, segregated than they were before Brown versus Board of Education. So certainly one of the major social justice issues of our times is giving equal access to education. Now, a third conception of social justice, or the way people think about social justice education, is more about what I was talking about before, which is different kinds of goals for education, right? One of which is social justice itself. So not so much how do we provide equal access for children, and are our schools socially just in that they're fair, but rather how do we teach kids about social justice and how to pursue it? How do we give kids the critical eye to look at policy, to look at social change, to look at social movements, and to understand and learn from historical social movements so that when they're moving forward, they can make change in society that aims towards the socially just. Now, this third idea about social justice is the one that has always captured my attention the most. It's what we do in schools, right? What is important to do in schools. And when we're narrowing the curriculum to only math and literacy, we're pushing all those other things out of the story. There's a story, Ken, of a guy on a street corner, and he's on his hands and knees, and he's looking for his keys. And this woman comes by and says, well, is everything okay? Can I help you? He says, yeah, no, I lost my car keys. And so she gets down on the ground with him, and they're looking for his keys. And 10 minutes go by, and she says, are you sure you lost your keys here? Because we've been looking here for a long time. He says, no, I lost them over there, down on the other corner. And she says, well, why are you looking here? And he says, because the street light is here. And I think what this story means to me in regards to public education is that the reason we've gotten to where we are is that this obsession with standards and accountability and testing has shown a streetlight that is so bright that it is obscuring everything else around it, all the other educational goals that should be and could be under the light. And we're blinded by that light, right? So if we only have scores in math and in literacy, then it's the only thing we need to look for. Some people say if the only tool we have are these tests, then we can only care about those things, right? What it leads us to do is stop caring about the things that we really should be caring about. We have assessment technology that is not that sophisticated, right? We know how to tell whether kids can add 2 + 2 and get 4. It's much harder for us to know whether kids can think creatively or think critically or be able to stand up for what's right or take their part in making history, right? Those are things that are not very easy to measure. And so what happens is, since we don't have ways to measure that, we can't really measure the things things that a lot of us care about. And so what happens is we start to care about the things that we can measure. And that is like this guy on the streetlight, right? He has light in that part of the street, and so he's looking for his keys there. But of course it's a fool's errand because his keys are somewhere else. And our educational goals are somewhere else. They're not in those particular test scores. Sometimes those test scores can be useful for narrow snapshots of where we've gotten in those narrow subjects, but they fail to tell us the full story of what's possible in public schools. And what happens with social justice goals in schools is they become victim to this narrowing of the spotlight, right? This narrowing of the thing. And as we all know, anyone who's taken a walk in the woods with a flashlight, it's not only that you're illuminating what you're pointing it at, but you're also darkening everything else around, right? As soon as you look away from the light, you can't see a thing. And it's the same way with educational goals right now. Because there's this bright light on only math and literacy, we are blinded to all the other goals and all the other aspirations that teachers have for their students within the classroom. And that's, I think, unfortunate in terms of meeting our democratic ideals in a public education system.
I love the metaphor. That's a great metaphor. And I also like the distinction you made between different ideas of social justice, that one is sort of around the idea of educational equity or equity of access. And it's pretty easy to imagine what that might look like, that all students, regardless of their demographics, have the same access to quality teachers, quality schools, resources, etc. That's fairly easy to imagine, although certainly a long, long way to go before that's a reality. It's harder to sort of imagine for many of us what the other vision of social justice education would look like, because most of us never experience that. And even people that would like to see an education that isn't just read the book, do the questions, prepare for the test. Most of us actually weren't lucky enough to go to a camp like you went to.
Yeah.
There's sort of a poverty of imagination. So I'm wondering if you could flesh out for us a little more either what it might look like, or perhaps some examples where you've actually seen public schools creating that type of education.
Yeah, I'm really glad you're asking me about that. And of course, for every school and classroom where a teacher has been handcuffed and restricted in what they're teaching, there are, of course, teachers and principals and even whole districts pushing back and creating other things. I like to think of the great education philosopher Maxine Greene, who just passed away last year. She said this phrase that I've always liked, that the purpose of education is to comfort the troubled and trouble the comfortable. And I've always thought that could be a real kind of guiding ideology for public education, in that, of course, public schools should be charged with creating a safe space where children can learn, and they should be made comfortable and made to feel like they are valued and so forth. But there's another aspect of education that's too often overlooked, and that is troubling the comfortable. That we have set ideas that need to be challenged, not because they're right or wrong, but because the idea of being challenged is at the heart of what public education in a democracy needs to be. And when we talk about social justice education, we have to look at a kind of teaching and learning that is constantly both comforting the troubled and troubling the comfortable. Now, there is much education like that, and there's many, many gifted teachers who do this every day in their classrooms. One of the, and historically, it's been around for a long time, too. I mean, John Dewey was probably one of the earlier progressive educators and proponents of a kind of education that both took the experience of students into consideration when developing a curriculum, and the idea that one of the great purposes of education was to improve society and to teach children how to improve society. The turn-of-the-century progressives in the 1920s and 30s had a kind of historical momentum for that. There was George Counts, who wrote the pamphlet Dare the Schools Build a New Social Order, which was much more explicit than Dewey was willing to go, and there were many others who surrounded that. But by the 1930s and 1940s, that had been fallen by the wayside and was an experiment that didn't succeed. But yet today, we still have many ideas that aim in that direction. I'll tell you about a couple. there's one school I know of that's actually in San Francisco, where they they organized their curriculum around something called learning challenges, and they took the disciplines and organized them pretty much around they put social studies at the center of the curriculum. And this is interesting because social studies today has been pushed to the margins, right? We're focusing on math and literacy, science, social studies, arts, gym, everything else is pushed to the background. But when you think about what a public education should be, social studies should be the center because it's the material that connects all the other subject areas. It makes it meaningful because it connects it to social questions of social importance, right? And that's why we're in schools, right? That's the reason we're there. And so what they do is they take on prompting challenges at this school, something like violence in the neighborhood or homelessness or hunger. And they organize, and it changes year to year, and they organize various aspects of the curriculum around those challenges. Now, it doesn't mean that they don't teach what's so often called the basics, right? Of course they do, but they link what they're doing in substantive ways, not in gimmicky ways, but in substantive ways to these prompting challenges. So, for example, one year I spent in this particular school, they had these learning challenges that were around the idea of hunger and homelessness. And so the social studies teachers were looking at that historically, and the history teachers about hunger and homelessness in the nation and also locally. The math teachers were looking at statistics of homelessness and hunger in their community and comparing it to other communities. The English teachers were reading literature on homelessness, on poverty, and on hunger. And the science class actually ended up transforming the roof of the school building, into a garden. And so they studied soil and photosynthesis and the dimensions of how to construct the boxes to hold the soil and so forth. And they actually planted a vegetable garden there. And they eventually held a fundraiser where they had Alice Waters, actually someone new, and came to cook the vegetables from the garden on the roof, and they did a fundraiser, and the money they raised from that they researched and then donated to homeless shelters in the community. Okay, now that's just one example, right? And we can think of so many ways of approaching those same kind of topics. But my point in giving that example is that it tied the teachers together in a professional community that was oriented towards the goals of teaching kids about social justice and social relevance of what they were learning. So that kind of timeless question, why do we have to know this? Is this going to be on the test? Those questions become irrelevant when you're tying learning to social ends and to goals that mean something to the kids, to the teachers that are teaching those kids, and to the rest of us who are supporting that kind of public education. And that's, I think, an example of the what education could and should be when we're talking about schools in a democratic society.
That is very cool. Are you comfortable saying what the name of that school is?
Yeah, this was some years ago, and it was Horace Mann Academic Middle School, which is now merged with Buena Vista. It's Buena Vista Horace Mann in the Mission District in San Francisco. And it was a real privilege to witness that curriculum at that time. And I know that those educators, teachers like Avi Black and Sandy Calvo are still working in the Bay Area, but they were very talented educators, and they came together at an important time in the life of that community to do that kind of curriculum. But there are many examples of that going on today as well.
Very cool. I know that you split your time between Canada and the United States. Can you say a word about how the educational systems are similar or different around their paradigms?
Yeah. So one of the most glaring differences goes back to when we were talking about the different ideas about social justice and equal access. Schools are not all equal in Canada by any means. There's plenty of issues in that regard, but schools are equitably funded. And as many of the listeners will know, of course, in the United States, schools are largely funded by real estate taxes, which, of course, is an absolute guaranteed way to create vast inequalities of the kind that hardly exist in so many other democratic nations. And as a result of so of course the funding for any given school ends up being proportional to the size of the houses around that school. In Canada, education is provincially funded, so it's similar to the States, but it's equitably funded that way, and none of the funding for the schools comes from real estate or from anything else that would create those vast inequalities. Now, you still have inequalities, of course, because parent councils in a wealthier neighborhood are going to raise X amount of money. Parent councils in a poorer neighborhood are not going to raise as much. You have more volunteering in a wealthier neighborhood and so forth. But this is a dramatic difference, and it's hard for people outside of the United States to believe the way that the education system in the United States is funded. And in fact, the funding formulas for many schools in the United States has already been deemed unconstitutional. It's just hard to know how to change it, right? Where to go. California is, of course, an incredible example of the depth of depravity that this kind of system can go to with the historic Proposition 13, which was a tax revolt against the funding of the public schools, and resulted in California moving from one of the most well-funded public education systems in the United States to one of the least funded and worst. And that's unfortunate, right? So that's one big difference, and so there is a lot more equity in that regard. On the other hand, many of the trends that have swept across the United States have leaped across the border as well. The obsession with testing, with standards, with accountability is not in every province in Canada, but in most. Ontario is one of the ones most fixed on this. We have something called the EQAO, which is Educational Quality Accountability Office, which always sounds a little Orwellian to me. And they administer a series of tests called the EQAO tests that have resulted, like we see in the United States and in other parts of Canada, in a narrowing of the curriculum to test preparation for those subject areas, which are math and literacy. And so in that sense, it's similar. Levels of poverty and inequality are not as high in Canada, although economic inequality is growing in Canada at a faster rate than in the United States. But that's partially because it wasn't so unequal to begin with. So there are some things where Canada is in a lot better shape, but some of the issues about social justice and about narrowing of the curriculum are very similar in the United States and Canada.
Okay, thanks for that. What is it that makes you most concerned about the future of education in the U.S., and what is it that makes you most hopeful?
What makes me most concerned about education, in particular in the United States, but really this is worldwide, is this increasing idea that has been gaining traction in so many sectors of our society that the business model for any institution, whether it's a for-profit corporation or a democratic institution like the public schools, that a business model is the best way or the only way to run these institutions. Nothing has ever been farther from the truth. And we know that education is not an institution or an enterprise that lends itself easily to that kind of model, because education is about human relationships. It's not about producing widgets. It's not about a bottom line. Sure, we can have managerial expertise deployed to run a system more efficiently or to accomplish certain tasks, overall in the education system. But what goes on in the classroom is something that has to be left to an entirely different arena, and that is the arena of relationship between the teacher and the student. What concerns me dramatically right now is that not only do we have this shift towards a corporate model of educational goals and educational methods, but we have that at the same time that there's a concentrated and coordinated attack on teachers themselves. And teaching, as any of us who've ever been a classroom teacher know, is probably one of the most difficult professions that many of us have faced. It's a profession of love, and there are tens of thousands of very gifted teachers out there doing the best they can with limited resources. The combination of this corporate agenda of educational reform, coupled with an attack on the status of teachers and the trust in teachers, is creating an environment where, first of all, some of the best teachers are going to leave and are already leaving. The best future teachers are going to be hesitant to enter the profession. And the ones that are there are going to be tied in a way and restricted in a way that they can't do their best work with students. And that's of great concern to me.
And what about what gives you the most hope?
What gives me the most hope, and I have a lot to be hopeful for right now, because things like the opt-out movement, there's tremendous pushback right now. We're experiencing a kind of renaissance of attention to what really matters in education, which is developing the whole child, making education a human enterprise, creativity, the arts, including the basics, and recognizing the potential for education to be a fully human endeavor. And we're seeing not only teachers pushing back, but parents pushing back, and a growing number of politicians and community activists as well. We're right now, I think, really seeing a swing of the pendulum back in the other direction. There are schools, districts, teachers, whole states even, that have now abandoned all or some of the standardized testing juggernaut that has been thrust upon them, some breaking the law to do so. And I think that that's only going to pick up more steam, and we're going to see a return to some of the things that parents know, that children know, and that teachers know matter in schools, in the classroom, and that gives me a lot of hope.
Mm-hmm. All right, well said. Anything else you want to address that we haven't covered today?
There's this saying that teachers have, that everyone loves to teach critical thinking, but no one wants a classroom full of critical thinkers, right? Because then you have kids who are asking questions all the time. And I love that saying because it captures the dilemmas that social justice educators have a lot. Of course, we have to facilitate a kind of learning environment that is controlled in some ways and predictable in some ways, right? On the other hand, everything that you and I have been talking about should be about relinquishing control, about creating an environment where sparks can fly, creating an environment where imagination can flourish. And that balance, I think, is one of the great challenges of teaching these days. And I'm hoping that more and more teachers get the opportunity to take that challenge to its fullest.
Mm-hmm. Beautifully said. Thank you for that. So our guest has been Dr. Joel Westheimer, Professor of Education and Democracy at the University of Ottawa, Canada, and an educational columnist for CBC, Canadian Public Radio. Joel, thank you so much for sharing your wealth of insight and your inspiration with us today.
Thank you, Ken. It was my pleasure being here.